Good morning, everyone. Well, actually, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luke Klipp. I'm the Education Director for Abundant Housing LA. This is something I do in my volunteer capacity. I really appreciate all of you taking a couple hours to be with us this Saturday afternoon. And just really quick, this is something that I've put together with the guidance and direction and support of the Abundant Housing LA team. We offer this once a month. So if you get something out of this and you want to come back, we'll be back next month. If you want to invite folks to join us anytime, I've also provided this presentation in various formats for very different organizations, different groups of folks who want to have it sort of tailored to them. And so I'm happy to talk with anyone afterward if you're interested in bringing this to your organization or some group that you know and you think would be interesting or helpful for them as well. So we'll go ahead and just dive right in. I would just ask that if you have questions, think about them, write them down if you need, and hold on to them till the end. I'm going to leave some time at the end here for us to take questions, but I would prefer that we hold off till the end for that, unless there's something that's really burning that is clarification you need on a particular slide. So yes, this is our Abundant Housing LA Housing 101, and my name is Luke, and I'm a volunteer. And oops, just started flying through the slides there. I don't know why that happened. Okay. Let's just go back. All right, so we have an agenda here. Yes.
Hi, I'm just going to clarify that we seem to have a question in the chat. So attendees are on mute, and if you've got questions, there's the Q&A function.
Yes.
And I think Luke mentioned this, but just we'll take them at the end. If you have questions for clarification, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll take them as they come.
Thanks, Esteban. And sorry for just sort of like diving in I was having a bit of a technical difficulty where I just started flying through the slides. But to sort of start off here, this is a primer. This is a 101. To be clear, there is so much information we could cover in terms of housing policy. And you could spend just hours upon hours learning about housing policy. I've really tried to pull together what in my experience of working in local politics and sort of observing how things play out in the housing venue, if you will, and trying to understand how we've gotten to where we are today. I've tried to really pull out what I think are really kind of key pieces to this story, to really understanding this, to really having sort of a grounding in when you want to get involved in housing policy. So this is really just like bits and pieces of a much, much bigger story, but it's a lot of bits and pieces. We're going to sort of move relatively quickly through this because I want to make sure we get through it, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on the history, and then also how it shapes our present. And then we'll sort of move relatively quickly through the last few pieces here on our agenda. This is a picture of St. Joseph's Hospital in Superior, Wisconsin. This is a hospital was built in the 1930s and then shuttered in the 1970s. I share this photo of this hospital in the middle of a small town in northern Wisconsin because I actually lived in this hospital for a couple years as a kid, back when it was an abandoned hospital. I share that because this is personal, right? Like as a white man, and as we'll see very soon, I have a great deal of privilege in the housing policy conversation, a great deal of privilege. And at the same time, I've also experienced housing insecurity in my own way with my family. And a lot of us have in our own experiences. That housing is an incredibly personal thing. And I really want us to be able to sort of look at the housing conversation through the lens that we bring to it, and also recognize sort of the policy issues that come to bear, which are not just about us, but about sort of bigger picture things as well. I offer here this tweet from the president, the outgoing president, about the suburban lifestyle, and don't worry in the suburbs that you will not be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. For those people who were sort of rudely awakened to the conversation of housing through the president's sort of bringing this up as he did in this sort of very awkward mechanism of this tweet here, this is something that is just part of a much, much bigger picture around our housing history and the context of housing, our housing conversation throughout the United States and here in Los Angeles. And the president was just picking up the very clear threads that exist that are in many cases, in many ways, maybe more subtle, and just kind of beating them out in very public fashion and making it very clear what was going on here, which we will see. He was just sort of picking up what's already out there and just sort of blaring it as he tends to do. So there are a couple core central ideas that are part of this Housing 101. The first of these three core central ideas is that single family zoning, which I also like to refer to as a multi-housing ban, leads to a number of societal challenges that we experience. In the city of Los Angeles, 75% of our residentially zoned land is zoned for single family zoning. And what that means is when you have a piece of land that is designated as its own single piece of land, you can only build one home on that piece of land. Regardless of the size of the piece of land, you can only build one home on that piece of land. So anyone who's going to buy that or live in that home has to buy all of the land and the home in order to live there. Versus multifamily housing, where you can have 2 homes, 4 homes, 6 homes, 10 homes, however many on any given size of piece of land. And people can basically pool their wealth either by renting or by being condos or whatever the case may be. People can pool their wealth rather than having to be independently wealthy enough to be able to buy the land and the home that sits on that land with single family zoning. So single family zoning is in this presentation, I'm offering up that this is leading to a large number of the societal challenges that we face today. The second core central concept in this Housing 101, which we're going to get into, is that our housing policy is systemically racist. Going back to the president's tweet, he was just picking up what's already out there. Our housing policy is systemically racist and has been for a very, very long time. This is not to say that this individual person or this individual policy is a racist person or a racist policy. It is to say that the agglomeration of all of the things in our housing policy and our housing policy history have resulted in and continue to perpetuate racist outcomes. So I want to sort of piece out sort of individuals from sort of the overall system, because I think sometimes when we get into especially like a fight over a particular housing project or whatever, it becomes very tempting to say, well, you're opposing this, that makes you a racist. But a lot of people don't see themselves as being racist because they oppose an apartment building or whatever, but they are perpetuating a racist housing policy by doing that. And we'll see what that means as we get into this. The third core concept in this is that we really need to distinguish between opinions that are individual opinions and institutional opinions. Everyone has opinions. We all have opinions, but only some of those opinions are backed up by the institutions that then enforce them. And here's a portion of the city of Los Angeles residentially zoned land across central LA. I mentioned earlier that 75% of our residentially zoned land is zoned for single family housing. That's the pink on this map, and the blue is multifamily. In central LA, actually, we have more multifamily housing zone area than single family. It's when you get into the valley in South LA where it's different. But this is to distinguish. In this case, I could say it should be multifamily housing everywhere, but that's just an individual opinion, because the institutional opinion, what's backed up by our laws in the city of LA, is that 3/4 of our residentially zoned land is zoned single family. So it's important to distinguish between individual opinions and institutional opinions when we get into this conversation. So diving into our housing history, I just saw this recently. I think it's really fascinating. Steam heaters are a product of an era, and the reason that they're under windows, and so something that's it's very relevant today in the midst of this pandemic. They're under windows in most cases because they were installed in an era where we wanted to have the windows open in our cities so that we could have air blowing through, because we knew that germs were accumulating, and during the 1918-1990 flu pandemic, people wanted open windows, but in the winter, you needed the house to be warm. So we installed steam heaters under windows so you could open the window, but then you could have the steam heater keeping the house warm. So we have this sort of relic of our history where steam heaters are under windows, which in some ways doesn't necessarily make sense, because that's also an area where the air could blow in or out more easily than if it was up against a wall. But they're installed there because the idea was, We want the windows open so we can keep the air moving through because of the flue. And we want to reduce the how much flue there is going around with windows closed, but also still be warm enough in our homes in the middle of the winter. So really, this is getting into like how our history shapes our present. So I'm gonna offer up here a video. It's very brief that I think kind of helps folks sort of see this. I'm going to offer up this. It was shared just a couple weeks ago by Bernice King.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions.
Sorry about that. My computer decided it is going to not work. What's going on? Hold on a second. Okay. Sorry about that, y'all. Let me see if I can get this up here. Okay, I apparently will not be able to do this. So what that was a video of Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King, talking about how the government policies for decades were to basically give away land, and largely he's talking about the Homestead Act, giving away millions and millions of acres of land almost exclusively to white folks. And this is something that happened largely in the 19th century into the early 20th century, and was the predecessor to subsequent policies, which we're really going to spend the most of our time with here talking today about housing history, that continue to sort of build on and amplify the preference of white home ownership, white property ownership over all others. And so I think it's just really, it would be special to see, and I can share the link afterward, just Dr. King speaking just for a moment about how this has just perpetuated these racial inequities. Sorry for the technical difficulties. My computer is having a day. So here's a very brief timeline of the last century, which I will go into these pieces, but I just want to point out three key things on the timeline here. We'll go through most of this, and that is the brown bar, the red bar, and the orange bar. The brown bar is essentially where we have the institutionalization of single family homes. In 1921, the city of LA created single family zones. So the thing that predominates our residential land zoning today didn't even exist a century ago in terms of our zoning. And now it predominates our city. And there's a very specific reason it was, or one very specific reason it was created. But for this period, from 1921 to 1948, where you see the Shelley v. Kraemer, it was explicitly available only to white homeowners. And we'll see why that was. So then the red bar is redlining. So during the time that we had explicitly racialized and segregated single family home ownership opportunities, we also then created redlining, which we'll get into. But the redlining was essentially legal and the law of the land for 40 years, from the mid-1930s to the late 1970s. And then that orange bar is an approximate bar. It's not as specific as the brown and red bars in this timeline, but this is a period of time where across the country, and especially here in Los Angeles, we engaged in very intentional downzoning, what I call constriction of our city, where we took a zone capacity for many, many more folks, and we gradually tightened and tightened and tightened and tightened the opportunities for new home ownership and new housing creation, to the point where we are basically at the max, when back in the 1950s and 60s, we would have been far, far away from the max with the number of homes we have even today. So we're going to dive into this timeline right now. So the very first thing is Buchanan v. Worley in 1917. And some folks will say, oh, housing's not intentionally, we've been good about sort of dealing with racism in housing. We'll point to this decision, which was a Supreme Court decision, which said, no, City of Louisville, you cannot in your zoning explicitly allow or disallow people from living in a community based on the color of their skin. Because the City of Louisville had zoning that they had put in place that said if a community is majority white, only white folks can live in it. And if a community is majority black, only black folks can go live in it. The Supreme Court said, no, that's not legal. You can't do this by city law. So what did we do instead? We created single family homes. We created single family home communities. A lot of the single family homes in Los Angeles that we think of today as just sort of being part of the city, these different communities across the city, were created, right? Like there was just land and we put a bunch of homes on it, starting especially in the 1920s and 30s. And people are familiar with the Hollywood sign, which used to be an advertisement for Hollywood land. The land is no longer on the sign, but it used to be Hollywood land. It was an advertisement to get people to come out to Hollywood land and look to buy a home. And Hollywood land is advertised in this brochure as protecting your family by procuring at today's prices a home place in the hills of Hollywood land, secured by fixed and natural restrictions against the inroads of metropolitanism, and yet within 25 minutes of 7th and Broadway. So what they're saying here, natural restrictions, is sort of like, well, there's hills and there's a little bit of distance, and so it's not as easy to get to as maybe something that's right sort of in the midst of the city. But the fixed restrictions, those are excuse me. Those are deed restrictions, which were put in place to limit both the opportunity for people to purchase a home for the very first time in that community, as well as to restrict people who are reselling a home in that community only to white folks, only to white households, and in some cases to white Christian households. They were restricting opportunities for home ownership on the basis of religion as well. So these were deed restrictions, these deed covenants were part of new single family homes. And they are what made it so that single family homes were only available to white buyers. In Eagle Rock, you'll notice this brochure for Eagle Rock says, the residents of Eagle Rock are all of the white or Caucasian race, which we know is not true today in 2020, but was very much how this community is being advertised less than a century ago, and what these homes, who these homes were available to purchase and invest in and build wealth with. The last thing here, I have an attention white home buyers. I was not on either of these particular flyers that I'm aware of, but that was from another single family community flyer. So then we have this Supreme Court decision in 1926, Corrigan v. Buckley. So remember, just 9 years prior, the Supreme Court said you can't do zoning that is explicitly racially segregating. But then in 1926, they say, however, you can have these deed covenants that say you cannot resell a home to a non-white household, or you can only this home is available for purchase, this brand new home is only available for purchase for a white buyer. The Supreme Court said that is perfectly legal in 1926. So now these are proliferating across the country, these deed restrictions in single family homes, and single family construction is exploding. And as we'll see in LA, single family construction, the black bars on this chart on the lower left-hand side here, we're seeing massive amounts of new single family construction. In 1923 alone, we saw nearly 20,000 new single family homes built in that 1 year. Now, this is a period of time where it is explicitly and perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of race for single family homes. You'll see in this chart that construction drops dramatically in the early 1930s during the Great Depression, and then rises back up in the late 1930s, where I've indicated a little black bar on the chart here because now redlining is legal in the late 1930s, which we'll get to in just a moment. One other thing I just want to note about all of this construction new housing, you'll see that in that 1923 bar, we constructed 44,000 new homes, including single family duplexes and multifamily housing. Well, how does that compare with today? Well, this is a chart, and I do apologize, the chart that I have here, it's a little bit less possible to read, and also the numbers are flipped. So the green bars in the bottom are actually multifamily, and it's the blue on the top that are single family. but it is scaled the same. It is scaled the same. So over the last 40 years, there's only 1 year where we had more than 23,000 new homes built in a single year. And you can even see for most of the 1990s, the number of new homes being built in LA was roughly equivalent to what we were building on an annual basis in the midst of the Great Depression. So there was a period of time where we were building almost no new housing in the city. And while it has come up again recently in the last few years, we're only averaging over the last decade about 10,000 new homes a year, which contrasts pretty sharply with what we were doing in the 1920s. So then we have the National Housing Act of 1934. And this came about with the FDR New Deal. And I've got a picture here of a Hooverville on the upper left corner. Herbert Hoover was the president when the Great Depression struck, and millions of people were left out of house and home. And they created these communities of Hoovervilles, which were encampments of folks who were homeless. Sound familiar? The more things change, the more they stay the same, unfortunately. And a lot of folks in the Great Depression were struggling to be able to afford any kind of place to live. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt created the Federal Housing Administration with the 1934 National Housing Act. And this was intended to do two key things. One, get people into homes. That was first and foremost. But two, allow them to build wealth with their homes. So that second piece is the really key piece here in terms of how this has played out since then in building out our housing policies here in LA and across the country. Because what the federal government did with the National Housing Act of 1934 was to create the Federal Housing Administration, whose Federal Home Loan Bank Board empowered the Homeowners Loan Corporation. You don't need to remember any of this because there's no test at the end of this, to create maps of all of the communities across the country. Because what the federal government was doing for the very first time is they were backing mortgages. If you wanted to buy a home prior to this, you would have to do it entirely through private lending, through a private bank, which, if you had a lot of money, you could probably do. But the thing that a lot of us maybe are familiar with hearing about in terms of home ownership today, the 30-year fixed mortgage, that was a creation of this bill. That was a creation of the Federal Housing Administration saying, we are going to, as a federal government, subsidize home ownership. We're going to back mortgages so that we're reducing the risk that private banks take on. Because think about it. Who can say today what you're going to be earning in 30 years? But the federal government was saying, we're going to make sure that the banks don't have to be as worried about the risk associated with that long window. Because you could get a private loan for a house prior to this act, but good luck getting anything more than a 10 or 15-year window. You're not going to be able to demonstrate that kind of level of risk that you can sort of handle, and the banks certainly wouldn't deal with it either. But a 30-year window, that's the federal government stepping in and saying, we're subsidizing this. So we created federally subsidized single-family housing. This, in my mind, is the single largest affordable housing program ever in the history of this country. It also, though, enabled the accumulation of wealth, which contrasts quite sharply with what we consider today to be affordable housing. Because today, in order to get into affordable housing, you have to be within a certain income level. And if that changes at any point, you no longer qualify for that affordable housing. So you can't buy into an affordable home and then accumulate wealth with that home and then have that wealth later on in life in our affordable housing program today. But this program, this National Housing Act of 1934, which created federally backed mortgages, became this mechanism for millions of people to afford to buy a home and build wealth in a home. And these were the maps that the federal government used. This is the LA map that the federal government used to determine levels of risk. Because the federal government didn't want to say, well, we're going to back a 30-year mortgage if the community that they were going to back that mortgage in is a community where that was way too risky. So the federal government said, we are still going to assess risk, but we're not going to assess it quite the same way that private banks have been doing it. So they created redlining maps. What people have heard of today is redlining. And the redlining name comes from the communities we see are actually in red on this map. But there are actually 4 colors on the map. There's green, there's blue, there's yellow, and there's red. and they run in that order of risk. So an area designated green on the map, you would have no problem getting a mortgage, a federally backed mortgage in that community. An area blue might be a little bit tougher, but it would be relatively easy still relatively easy. An area designated yellow, now it's going to be pretty tough to get a federally backed mortgage in that community. And an area that is red, it's impossible. Now, this is really important because even though home ownership was available through private banks, it was the federally backed program that made it widely available. This became a rapid investment in subsidizing home ownership across the country and here in LA as well. So these redlining maps were used to determine where you could purchase a home. And so what were the criteria then that were used to determine green, blue, yellow, and red? Well, it's pretty simple here. So I've circled an area in green and an area in red, just so because you can actually find all of these descriptions online. They're all available online. There have been some really great entrepreneurial folks who've gone out and found this information. So that community right next to Runyon Canyon that I circled in green was described as having business and professional men, executives, capitalists, motion picture stars with annual incomes of $3,600 and upward. But then they include that there are 0% foreign families, no nationalities, 0% Negro, and no apparent or anticipated shifting or infiltration. That's a term that maybe we're not familiar with here, but it's a very specific term. For the area in Westlake that I circled in red, Westlake MacArthur Park, they described it as having skilled artisans, laborers, white collar and works progress administration workers with incomes of $700 to $2,000 annually, 20% foreign families, with Japanese and Russians and some Mexicans, 10% Negro, and shifting or infiltration of Japs and Negroes rapidly. Now, keep in mind, this is a document that was used to determine whether or not you could get a mortgage in this community. And the area outlined in red that has that because it was 10% Negro and had shifting or infiltration of Japs and Negroes rapidly in this official document, you could not get a federally backed mortgage in this community for 40 years. For 40 years, you could not get the most powerful affordable housing subsidy program in the country, in our history, because this community in this document was described as having 10% Black community members and an infiltration of folks of Japanese heritage and Black Americans rapidly. But furthermore, and also importantly, further in these documents, the area next to Runyon Canyon is described as having racial protection in perpetuity. And what that means in this document is that those deed restrictions that I referenced earlier, those deed covenants on those homes, the federal government determined that those were so locked in stone, there was no way that anyone who was not white was going to be able to live in this community. And so therefore, this community is great. You can have a federally backed mortgage in this community. There's no risk associated with it. But that Westlake MacArthur Park community, they described the deed restrictions as, quote, leaving much to be desired. But however, they said they do protect against racial hazards. So in the eyes of the folks who put together these maps, the Westlake MacArthur Park area, you could not get a federally backed mortgage. It was way too risky because of the percentages of folks who were non-white who lived there. But they also did feel like that the deed restrictions that existed would provide some protection against racial hazards. These are terms that were used in documents that determined who could purchase a home with federally backed mortgages in these communities for virtually 2 generations, for 40 years. So moving forward to 1948, because those maps were made in the mid-1930s, it's still explicitly legal to discriminate on the basis of race in deed covenants in single-family homes. We have this Supreme Court decision in 1948, Shelley v. Kraemer. This was the first time the Supreme Court actually ruled against deed covenants. And what's important about this is actually this came out of the very first ruling that moved the needle on this was right here in LA in a community named Sugar Hill. And I've pictured here Hattie McDaniel on the upper left-hand side, who was the first Black winner of an Academy Award for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind. She subsequently bought a home in Sugar Hill in the 1940s. Sugar Hill is a community of, or at the time, was a community of very large, expensive mansions and Hattie purchasing a home, she was able to do this because the white homeowners just went ahead and ignored the deed covenant that existed on their home and were willing to sell it to her. And subsequent to that, other folks who were Black folks in the entertainment industry started buying homes in Sugar Hill. And the white neighbors who were still in Sugar Hill at the time got really upset and took them to court. And the very first time that a court ruled against covenants, against these deed restrictions that were on the basis of race, was in 1945 because of Hattie McDaniel and the folks in the community who were taken to court by the white homeowners in Sugar Hill. And the white homeowners were told, nope, these deed restrictions don't have the force of law. And in 1948, the Supreme Court agreed. The Supreme Court said, yep, deed covenants no longer can be enforced in the courts, which is not to say that they didn't still exist, and we'll see how that plays out. But the Supreme Court said you can no longer enforce them in the courts. So we had this federally backed mortgage program that was created with the New Deal. But even then, public housing was still very unaffordable for a lot of folks. There were a lot of people who were out of house and home who needed a place, who couldn't afford a home even with a 30-year window of repaying back a mortgage. And so the federal government created public housing, which was publicly funded housing. However, it was also racially segregated, explicitly so. And that was actually something that the US legislature, the House and the Senate, reaffirmed in the late 1940s through some additional actions they took that said, yeah, we want this housing to be racially segregated. So public housing was created, but it was racially segregated. In California, we decided we didn't like public housing that much. And in 1950, we passed Article 34. It was a ballot measure approved by the voters, which said, if you want to build publicly funded housing in any community in the entire state, you need to get a vote in affirmative of the voters. You need to get, so for instance, if the city of San Fernando wanted to build a 40-unit public housing building, right, like publicly funded housing, they would have to go to the voters of San Fernando and say, please say yes. And if the voters of San Fernando said no, they couldn't build it. Wouldn't be possible. This Article 34 is still in the Constitution. It's still in our state. It is still legally enforced in the state constitution. Now, there is an effort underway to remove it. And there's a bill that was introduced in the legislature in this session that's starting in 2021, but they literally just dropped bills this week to actually put a measure before the voters, because it can only be undone by the voters, to put a measure before the voters in 2022 to undo Article 34. But it's still the law of the land. And you may be thinking, but don't we still provide publicly funded housing? Yes. However, it's still, because Article 34 is the law of the land, it requires cities and local governments to jump through a bunch of additional hoops. So for instance, LA voters approved Measure JJJ a couple of years ago, which provided bonding for the creation of new affordable housing, which they also included a number of how many affordable homes would be provided as part of that, so that number it allows the city to sort of work within that. So it was, I believe it was 10,000. I don't know the specifics on this, but I believe it was 10,000. So the city basically got the approval of the voters, not just for the bonds, but for 10,000 publicly funded homes. This one article adds somewhere between, there was a study that was done a couple of years ago on this, adds somewhere between $5,000 and $20,000 to the cost to build each new affordable home. Each new publicly funded home it costs an additional $5,000 to $20,000 to build because of this, which was put on the ballot by the California Real Estate Association, or the Association of Realtors, who are now part of the effort to remove it from the Constitution. But this functionally stopped creation of public housing in California at the time, and has made it inordinately difficult to do any more since then. So then we have what I call, and what a lot of people refer to as white flight. From the 1950s to 1970, approximately, we have in LA County, there's about a 10-year window within this couple decades where we saw over 30 communities incorporate in LA County. LA County has 88 cities, right? It's a very, very large county. We'll get into that in a little while. It has 88 cities. Over a third of them incorporated in within a fewer than 10-year window during this white flight period. And the primary focus in the creation of these much smaller communities across LA County was local control. Local control. Think about how much that comes up now as we talk about COVID and sort of the county trying to sort of say, here's the county thing. And then you have individual cities saying, no, we want to do our own thing. We have our own thing that we want to do. That is sort of the reason that these cities were incorporated as they were was so that each individual city could impose its own local control. And at the time of white flight, it was really about single family home ownership, which was still very much being restricted to white homeowners. There were three things that enabled this rapid growth of these communities in this period from the 1950s, 1970s. One thing I'll just quote from, one of them was I'll quote from Richard Rothstein, who wrote the book Color of Law, which is a really incredible book if you have a chance to read it. He quotes saying, builders went to the Federal Housing Administration and submitted plans for development for, in this case, he's referring to the city of Lakewood. I don't mean to pick on Lakewood, but they're a prime example of this from this period of time. So Lakewood was a city that was just a piece of land, and builders wanted to build a 17,000 home subdivision and make it Lakewood. So they went to the Federal Housing Administration, submitted their plans, and the plans had to include a commitment that they would never sell a home to an African American. Never. And this was a requirement of the federal government in the 1950s. The Federal Housing Administration required a commitment that each of these homes have a clause in that deed for every single home, prohibiting the resale of homes to African Americans or rental to African Americans. So it's not coincidental that, for instance, Lakewood this past year, for the very first time, now has a Black member of their city council in 2020. And for a city that was incorporated 70 years ago in probably one of the most diverse counties in the country. This is what happened in many communities across LA County. Another key part, the second thing that really enabled this rapid growth of white flight was the freeway network. And I'll get to that in a moment. And the third thing is contract cities. Lakewood is actually, again, here an example because they were the first. Most cities, when they incorporated, prior to Lakewood, when they incorporated, they had to stand up their own police department, their own fire department, their own school district, all these things they had to do on their own. And Lakewood said, no. We're just going to contract out. We're going to contract with county sheriff. We're going to contract with county fire department. We're going to just contract these things out. And that became what's termed a contract city. And Lakewood was taken to court over that. And the courts ruled in their favor. And once the courts did that, a bunch of other cities incorporated under the same model, where they didn't have to stand up all of the resources and functions of a city. They just had to pay someone else to do it. So this was the third thing that really enabled white flight here in LA County. So I mentioned the freeway network, our rapidly expanding freeway network. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 put an enormous infusion of federal money into the highway program. The federal government matched every local dollar $9 to 1. So for a freeway project that would cost $100 million, the federal government would cover 90 and the local government only had to cover 10. So you can imagine this was an enormous infusion of federal resources that local governments were happy and eager to take up. And we saw massive construction of our freeway networks starting in the mid-50s all the way into the 1980s, especially. But what's important to note here, and why I offer two historic photos to demonstrate sort of the impact of these freeways, is they didn't go through areas that didn't have people already. They went through communities that had to be wholly displaced, that had to be removed to create freeways. And it is very intentional, as we'll see in a little while, it is very intentional where these freeways went. Every little bend and curve of the freeway network, that's by design. There are very intentional things about this that I think today, when you go and drive on the freeway, you may not really think about or realize or understand, but this was all very much by design and came about at a time when we were doing all kinds of really horrible things in our communities after years and years of explicit racial segregation in the midst of the era of redlining. And I want to offer this photo that was, it's just a Google Maps street view photo, but this is the 10 freeway. And you might look at this and say, well, why is this on here? It's just a picture of the 10 freeway. This is Sugar Hill. You may remember I brought up Hattie McDaniel and how Sugar Hill was a big deal because it became this community of renowned Black entertainers in the television and film industry who were buying these large mansions in this community that became known actually across the country as this community of wealthy Black homeowners. Well, when it came time to decide where to put the 10 freeway, it came down to two choices. Either they could put it through fraternity sorority row right near USC, or they could put it through Sugar Hill. And we chose Sugar Hill. And while a few of those mansions, including Hattie McDaniel's, still exist, they are now right up against a 12-lane freeway. And most of what Sugar Hill was removed and torn out to create the freeway. And that is not just Sugar Hill. That is all across the country and certainly across the LA region, how we made decisions about where to put freeways and where not. Even in just that little bit of the 10 freeway that goes into Santa Monica, just that little bit that goes into Santa Monica also tore out one of the only Black communities in Santa Monica. All right, this is across the board how we made decisions about where to put our freeway networks. I want to note the Rumford Act and Prop 14. These are probably things you've maybe never heard of, but the Rumford Act, so, I've talked about like it's explicitly legal to discriminate on the basis of race in housing. Well, guess what? There are actually people who didn't like that, right? There are people who said we shouldn't be doing this. It shouldn't be allowed. And so we actually passed a law in California in 1963 named after the author, Senator Rumford, who actually wanted to bar discrimination on the basis of race in all housing, but that was too radical. So they limited it only to buildings of 5 units or more. So basically apartment buildings of, a small to medium size or anything larger than that, you could no longer discriminate on the basis of race. In 1963, the law was signed into law by Governor Pat Brown. And then 1 year later, the voters came up with, we got to vote on Proposition 14. Proposition 14 was to overturn the Rumford Act. It was to say, no. We actually want, in the case of the flyer here on the left-hand side, to restore California property owners the right to choose the person or persons to whom they wish to sell or rent their residential property, i.e., we want to be able to discriminate on the basis of race. Proposition 14, even though it was explicitly segregationist, passed 2-1, 65% in favor. And in LA County, 70% voted in favor of Proposition 14. And not coincidentally, subsequent to its passage, Governor Brown said, I'm taking this to court. He fought it in court, and he lost his re-election bid in 1966 to a guy named Ronald Reagan, who, before he was even sworn into office, announced to the state that he would seek the repeal of the Rumford Open Housing Act. So Ronald Reagan wasn't just blowing a dog whistle, he was blowing the whistle. He was basically saying, yeah, well, I'm all about discrimination on the basis of race in housing. Now, the state did lose, the Prop 14 lost in the courts in 1967, and 1 year later, we saw the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which I'll get to in just a moment. But before I do, I want to call out this constriction that I had on the timeline, because at the same time as we had the Rumford Open Housing Act of 1963 and Prop 14 in 1964, we have this, what I call the quintessential affordable housing, getting built in large quantities in LA. What you probably can picture, it's these apartment buildings, usually between 5 and 8 units, which under the Rumford Open Housing Act, you could no longer discriminate on the basis of race if you were renting out in one of these buildings, which were being built in large numbers across the city at this time. And they are today some of the naturally affordable housing because they fall under rent control. So in 1958, shortly after we started seeing these dingbats getting built across the city, parking minimums were increased. So we said, you know what, we need a little bit more parking in these. But functionally, you could still kind of like put the parking under the building, and it was enough for the units that were on top. But regardless, architects who were designing these dingbats, they had to work backward. They had to say, okay, how many square feet do I have in this property? What can I do in this? Okay, I can build X number of apartments because I can fit X number of parking spaces on this property. They had to figure out how many parking spaces they could put on a piece of land, and therefore that would determine how many apartments they could build. They still do that today. That is still very much how buildings get designed today. They're just very different types of buildings. But then in 1964, the same year that the voters of California approved Proposition 14 overwhelmingly, LA adopted an ordinance that increased parking minimums just a little bit, right? Just a little bit, just from 1.25 spaces unit to 1.5 spaces unit. That's not that bad, right? So it's just a little bit. But when you think about the implications, because architects had to determine how many units they could build based on how many spaces they could put on a piece of land, this actually ended the mass production of dingbat apartments. So we stopped building these apartments, which were one of the only sort of proliferating types of housing we were creating at this time, where you were no longer allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. But we stopped the production of those units just by a little increase in those parking minimums. So then we have the Fair Housing Act in 1968, because, oh, by the way, a lot of people thought it was pretty bad that we were discriminating openly on the basis of race and housing. And the Fair Housing Act said, you can no longer discriminate in housing accommodations on the basis of race. And this is a key part of all the civil rights bills of the 1960s. This was one of the civil rights acts, and the Fair Housing Act was a big, big deal when this was passed in 1968. One thing I would note, however, is that it came only on the heels of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This was being held up in the Senate with a couple of different senators, mostly Southern senators, who didn't want to see it happen, and so it was just languishing in the federal government, in the Senate. And then it was subsequent to Dr. King's assassination. 1 week after his assassination, the bill was finally cleared through the federal government, Senate and House, and signed into law by President Johnson. So there's a few things that I tie into this thread, because now we've said it's no longer legal to discriminate openly on the basis of race and housing. So, okay, so what happens then? What starts to happen? And I've labeled this era as sort of constriction, right? We've been really sort of like tightening things up to make it harder and harder to build housing. Well, we passed in California under the leadership of Ronald Reagan, the California Environmental Quality Act in 1970, which was initially only intended to apply to really large, big public works projects like a big stadium or a big freeway or whatever. But within just a year or two, applied to everything. Because the court said, oh no, if you can't just apply it to this, you've got to apply it to everything. So CEQA became this massive new impediment to the creation of new housing, which we'll see a little later on how that affects our housing crisis today. We also had President Nixon at the federal government level, who stopped the federal government from funding the creation of new public housing in the early 1970s. You'll remember that public housing was explicitly segregated on the basis of race. And the 1968 Fair Housing Act ended that. You could no longer do that. So now you can no longer build federal housing in this or that community and say, oh, don't worry, nearby homeowners, this is only going to be white folks who are allowed to live in this community. You have to allow anyone who wants to and who needs to be able to live there to do so. And Nixon, recognizing that this potentially, for whatever reason he decided, but let's just say it's not coincidental that shortly after you could no longer discriminate on the basis of race, the federal government got out of the business of funding public housing. And then we have this era of urban renewal. Urban renewal is a period of a couple decades which ties very neatly in with the construction of massive freeway projects, where we determined whole communities as blighted or slums and tore them out completely. This is a community in Los Angeles, a community that no longer exists. It's Bunker Hill. And you may think, well, you may not even know where Bunker Hill is, but let's assume you do. If you know where Bunker Hill is, none of this is recognizable because none of that exists anymore. Bunker Hill, after it was cleared because it was deemed to be a slum, looked like this. And this is the construction of all of the civic center facilities, and the the Center Theater Group area, the Chandler Pavilion, the LADWP, the area where we now have Walt Disney Concert Hall, Grand Park. This was an area that was a whole thriving community that was actually redlined because it was so racially mixed. Because it was so diverse of a community, we redlined it. The federal government redlined it. I don't mean to say we like I'm the federal government, but this is what was done in our name, and made it impossible for folks to purchase and invest in their communities with federally backed mortgages. And that community then was deemed subsequently, a couple decades later, a slum, torn out completely, and turned into what it is today. So I do want to note the Community Reinvestment Act was a federal bill passed in 1977 that finally, once and for all, said redlining is no longer legal. Now, there had been legal challenges up to that point that were eating away at how it was applied, but it was not until 1977 that it was finally once and for all ended. So this was the law of the land for functionally 40 years. And only 1 year later, here in California, again, I'm tying pieces together here that I think are relevant, but only 1 year later, California passed Proposition 13 in 1978. Now, we've been engaging now for a period of time in constriction and making it harder and harder and harder to build housing. And subsequently, housing prices were starting to skyrocket. And homeowners, who are a very politically powerful group, were saying, wait, we can't afford, because property taxes would fluctuate dependent on the value of your home. And people were seeing their home values increasing rapidly. So they said, no, we're going to pass this thing, which actually set property taxes back at the level they were in 1976, and then said you could only increase them a little bit year over year. This had massive implications, which we'll get to in a little bit, but it had massive implications for our everything, really, truly. But it locked in this financial advantage that homeowners who had been given advantages for decades on the basis of race were able to lock in through Prop 13. And then in LA, we did this thing in 1986, which is sort of this like little quirk thing, but it was of the era. And a lot of the groups that were behind this are still today fighting the city over efforts to create transit-oriented communities and other mixed-use housing and multifamily housing, especially around transit. But in 1986, gave us Proposition U. Proposition U was put forward. I've got a picture there of Xavier Oslavsky at the time as city council member in the city of LA. Politically, tactically smart in saying, I'm going to bring this forward, because there were a couple different projects that had happened on some corridors in LA in different communities that had a lot of political power. I've got them pictured here. You got the West Side Pavilion, upper left-hand side. It was on the west side of LA. The Fujita building that was up in Encino in the valley, and then the Beverly Center in West LA, which he said people were upset about. They were like, these are too big. These are, behemoths, monoliths, whatever you want to call it. And Proposition U downzoned every single major corridor in the city of LA. The voter approved it 70-30. And what it did was it took the amount of that you could build on any given piece of land, and it cut it in half across every single corridor in the entire city. And by virtue of that one bill, probably, this is back in the napkin math, wiped off the map the ability to create about 1 million apartments. One ballot measure, Proposition U. Still the law of the land today. So we had this massive period of constriction this period of massive constriction. It was not a massive period. It was a period that was actually relatively brief, because in 1960, we had zoned capacity. In other words, you could build based on our zone, you could build housing for up to 10 million people in 1960. But by 1990, we had reduced that down to a zone capacity of only 3.9 million. So we did a lot of things, whether it was through the CEQA stuff, Prop U, parking requirements, you name it. There were a lot of different pieces that played into this, but all of it functionally had the same effect of making it harder and harder and harder to build housing in LA. The one and only time that I can find where LA's voters approved increasing the opportunities for creating housing in our city was Measure JJJ in 2016. And that measure led to the creation of transit-oriented communities, which allows for denser housing to be built along transit in the event that it provides some percentage of designated affordable housing. And that is now single-handedly creating more affordable housing than anything else we've done in terms of designated affordable housing. And it is also in the courts. It is being litigated by some of the same people who gave us Proposition U 30 years ago, who are now fighting Measure JJJ. So how do these things play out today? I offer the past policies are like zombies. They're not dead. It takes a lot of change. They just keep coming back. So there's a few things. One is that the vast majority of our housing is a lot older than anything in the last 40 years, right? So most of our housing was built when it was explicitly legal to discriminate on the basis of race. A large part of the housing that was built prior to the 1990s is single family housing. And I think it's also important to note that the current pace of our housing construction pales compared to what we did back decades ago. Back when it was perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of race, we were building housing like crazy. But then we made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, and subsequently, it's become harder and harder and harder to build housing. I tie those things together. Some others might not, but I think it's important that we consider the context. It talked about our freeway through communities that were largely Black and brown communities. That's absolutely the case. This overlay shows you our freeway network and our redlining maps. And the freeway networks were planned and built largely when redlining was still perfectly legal. And there's an activist that I'll quote who said that LA only built about 60% of the freeways that it planned to build, but in communities of color, in Black and brown communities, it built 100% of the freeways it planned to build. Case in point, Boyle Heights, East LA, where we have 5 freeways going through a community versus the 2 freeway, which we'll note ends in Echo Park. It just sort of stops, it ends, because it was planned to go through all the way through Beverly Hills out to the west side, to the 405. And it turns out when you want to go through communities that had been beneficiaries of the largest subsidized affordable housing program this country's ever seen, who are all primarily white, wealthy-ish homeowners, they organized and they had political power and they had institutions on our side and not just individual opinions. They had institutional opinions that backed them up and stopped the creation of freeways in their communities. So freeways were built through Black and brown communities, and they were built to sort of separate. You can see on the west side here where the 405 goes through, you've got a red-lined community, then you've got the 405 freeway, and then a blue community around Westwood. So they were used as ways to separate and to completely obliterate communities. This was happening at the same time as the urban renewal, where we saw communities being wiped off the map. Freeways were being used because there was so much federal resources too that was backing up the creation of these. They were being used to dismantle whole communities. I also offer up here some blue stars, which show you where the public housing that was created largely in that single decade from the 1940s until we made it almost impossible with Article 34 in 1950, almost all created in communities that are redlined. But some other things about how redlining plays out today in terms of public health. It turns out that our redline communities are hotter, like literally temperature-wise, hotter than green and blue line communities. In LA, this works out to about 6 or 7 degrees. So on a day where the temperature might be in a green or blue line community, let's say 85 degrees, in a red line community, it'll be above 90. And this has huge implications for public health. And a study of 108 areas across the country, they found that in some communities, that difference in temperature was up to 13 degrees. This is huge. People need to get cooler at night in order for their bodies to recover. They need to be able to have shade. They need to be able to stay cool during the day wherever possible. Like these are significant implications. It turns out that our communities that were redlined for decades, they're also a lot less safe to walk or bike. People die on them more frequently. They get hit and injured severely on them more frequently, which is what the second study looked at. It also turns out that the neighborhood racial composition is a stronger determinant today of the appraised value of homes than it was in 1980. In 2015, neighborhood racial composition is a stronger determinant of appraised values than it was in 1980. And in homes where neighborhoods where the share of the population is 50% Black, they're valued at half the price of homes in neighborhoods with no Black residents. Now, look, I offer this up because some folks will say, but look, Luke, today it's not like it was 100 years ago, right? Like there are Black homeowners, there are Latino homeowners, there are Asian homeowners, right? And they'll say, you know, just because we were explicitly racist, 80 years ago up to 40 years ago, doesn't mean we are still today. Actually, we're even more racist than we were 40 years ago in terms of the value we place on people's homes. And think about this. In an area like LA, where homes are incredibly expensive, this has two key implications I just want to highlight. One is that homes are where people often build their wealth, right? This is an area where for generations, primarily white homeowners have been able to pass wealth down from generation to generation. So that's one key thing. The second key thing in this is when we think about gentrification and think about how real estate agents will say, Highland Park is the new Echo Park and Echo Park was the new Silver Lake, and it's sort of like there's this constant sort of moving thing of like, well, there's this community over here where the folks who have enough money to buy a home, but not in that whiter community because the home values have gone up because it's whiter, can go into this community that's not as white because which means that home values are depressed because neighborhood racial composition is a stronger determinant of appraised values today than it was 40 years ago. So this has huge implications today for home ownership, access, and opportunities. But even more, this just plays out over and over and over. Redline communities have parks that are half as large and 5 times as crowded as non-redline communities. Majority white is what the term is that the Trust for Public Land use. You'll see a lot of these sort of terms, the majority white, whatever. Let's be clear, we explicitly segregated our communities on the basis of race for decades. So it's not a coincidence that we now have the majority white community here and the majority Black community there. That's how we designed it. And we also designed it so all these other effects come about as a result of that. And then policing, because of course policing plays into this as well. Predominantly Black neighborhoods are both over-policed when it comes to surveillance and social control and under-policed when it comes to emergency services. So when we have this conversation, right, about defund the police, people's experience of policing is very different based on where they live. And it turns out that in segregated, police don't just respond to segregated landscapes, they construct and maintain them. So those communities that were redlined a century ago and for 40 years, not even a century ago, 90 years ago, and for 40 years after that, policing responds to that and reinforces it today in 2020. So I'm hoping that I can get this video to work unlike the last one, but I want to share something here. Let's see. Okay. Oh, come on. Okay. Esteban, can you see this?
I can, yes.
Okay, great.
When I was growing up, they told us, oh, like you guys are more prone to diabetes or you guys are more prone to heart disease. But it wasn't until I was about 23 years old that people in my life actually started to pass away from this. That's really the point behind Supermarket, is just eradicating this unnecessary amount of death that happens that can be fixed with just food.
There's about 119 liquor stores in South LA, and there's only 91 grocery stores. So there are swaths in the community where there are no grocery stores. Yet you could easily go buy an extra value meal or a combo somewhere. It's easier to find a soda than an apple.
We're a low-cost organic grocery that makes it affordable for people to eat well in Los Angeles' food deserts. We provide fresh fruits and vegetables. Everything we serve is 100% organic. And in addition to produce, we also carry staples like nuts, dates, coconut oils. During the COVID crisis, we did a big giveaway where we were giving out like beans and rice and lentils and things that are shelf-stable. So there already was an issue with food access, and the COVID crisis made that very apparent.
families that live in low-income residences, they may not have access to foods or stores like Whole Foods and some of these other stores that are well known for having fresh vegetables and other options. There may be more convenience stores, corner stores that may actually have canned good items with a lot of salt in them. That may not be the best option for you if you have high blood pressure.
This also speaks to many years and generations of disenfranchised realities for South LA. One of the interesting facts about the 92 riots as an outcome was South LA created coordinated lists of things that they needed as a community to sort of rebuild. And one of the major asks during this time in terms of rebuilding was more grocery stores. What was talked about in 92 has been unfulfilled since.
Those are the same demographics of people who in multiple states are the ones with the highest rates of these chronic conditions. I think this has just unveiled things that have been there for decades that we have had blinders on, but COVID-19 unveiled it in such a way that you don't have the luxury, no matter how privileged you are, you don't have the luxury to ignore it.
You can't control what's on your fork. You can't control your lifespan. You can't control how you feel on a day-to-day basis. You can't control your life. The work that we do is really to liberate communities across America eventually from the issues that they're plagued with health and access.
I apologize for that. All right. Should I get them to stop? So that was a little bit about understanding COVID as well and its impact in communities. This is a map the LA Times put together a couple weeks ago. And they have two things on this map. They have, you'll see colors ranging from like a darker green to like a yellow to a red. And then you'll see dots that are either little tiny dots or medium dots or bigger, darker dots. And the coloring, the green to the red, is from the Cal EnviroScreen. The EnviroScreen measures quality of air pollution levels, I should say, in communities. So the redder colors are where air pollution is the worst, and the greener are where it's the best. And then the dots are the prevalence of COVID. Now, this was a few weeks ago, so it's changing as we're in the midst of this horrible pandemic right now. But at the time this was done, what they were seeing was that there was a nearly one-to-one correlation between the quality of air, the level of air pollution in a community over time, and the prevalence of COVID. So that in communities that had the worst air quality, these were the communities that had far and away the worst COVID crisis. And in communities with the best air quality, they are far and away that had the least impact from COVID. And this plays out, which you just saw, in terms of people's access to food, to basic amenities, basic services. What we have done with redlining, with that being the practice for generations, with that being how the federal government made it possible for people to afford home ownership opportunities based on the basis of race for decades, we have created segregated communities that have subsequently then become how we have allocated resources in any number of ways, from parks to safe streets, to food, to air quality, you name it. This has just been a ripple effect that has rippled over time and keeps being reinforced through things like policing and keeps being a challenge for us to address. And it turns out that it still is the case that people are discriminated against explicitly on the basis of race. A study that was done a couple of years ago by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that Black folks were were twice as likely to be denied a conventional home loan as white folks, and twice as likely to be denied home refinancing as white folks. In the city of LA, of our white households, 45% are homeowners, own their homes, versus households only 20%. In 2015, 30% of Black and brown borrower homes, all homes across the country, 30% had gone into foreclosure, a third, as compared to 10% of whites. And this was largely because of the 2008 housing market crash, which was precipitated by lending, which was, I had a term for it and I'm going to forget it right now, the subprime mortgages, which were targeted largely at Black and brown home buyers, even though the banks that were lending these knew that these were terrible products, and they were targeting these at folks who had been denied home ownership opportunities for their lives, for their previous generations, and they were finally getting that access, but it was only through tools that were basically designed not to work. They were designed to fail and force these folks into foreclosure. The other thing I note here, in 2020, Black home ownership is about the same as it was at the time we made it explicitly no longer legal to discriminate on the basis of race. So here we are 50 years later, 50 years since we passed the Fair Housing Act, which, by the way, didn't say, hey, you know what? We've had decades upon decades of explicit discrimination on the basis of race. Let's do something to remedy that. Let's do something to actually support the folks who were denied all that access to wealth building all this time. We just said, oh, it's all equal now. It's all the same. And as you can imagine, the folks who benefited from the largesse of the federal government support for all those decades continued to, and the folks who didn't continued to not. And the Black and white homeownership gap is larger today than any time it has been in the past 30 years. One thing I noted from a book I'm reading on Black banks, after the Civil War, right after the Civil War ended, Black households across the country owned about 0.5% of the nation's total wealth, right? So right after we finally said slavery is no longer legal, right? Black households had 0.5% of the nation's wealth. Today, in 2020, that number is 1%. So in 150 years, from the time when we finally said slavery is no longer legal to today, Black home ownership has increased, or excuse me, not Black home ownership, Black the share of national wealth that Black households own has gone from 0.5% to 1%. And we have in terms of this is a map which shows where people live. This is central LA. You can probably recognize it's not a very well labeled map, but you can probably recognize this is downtown over here on the right. You got the 405 running from the upper left corner down toward the bottom center part. And the blue dots are white folks. The yellow dots are Latino folks. The green dots are Black folks. And the red dots are Asian in the census designations. And you'll see that sort of like where these folks are sort of located across the LA basin. And the more white you have between dots, they're spread out, which is largely an indication of this is a single family community, because where single family homes are, people are living further apart. So you do see that there are a few communities here in the sort of central and southern parts of this map where we have a number of Black single family communities, Ladera Heights, Crenshaw, Inglewood. But then we also have this proliferation of of white home ownership that is almost exclusively white in 2010 and would still be so today in 2020 in sort of the mid-Wilshire area, working west out toward the hills, the Hollywood Hills, Brentwood, Westwood, and further west. So I want to say a little bit about constriction. These are two properties in Silver Lake that their zoning is the same. On the right, you have an apartment building built in 1928, which has 28 studio and one bedroom apartments. There's no parking. It's 3 stories, and a studio apartment rents for $1,500 a month. On the left, built in 2013, it's 4 stories. It's 11 two-bedroom condos with 20 parking spaces, and a single condo there will cost you $1.1 million. The building on the left is what the zoning allows. That building on the right is no longer legal to build based on today's zoning. It doesn't have enough parking for starters. Probably the most important thing in all of that, because that's incredibly difficult to build and expensive. And how this constriction is played out today is we used to see more of this sort of like 2, 4, 6, 8 unit type buildings Now it's basically impossible. That 28 unit building in Silver Lake, you couldn't build today because you need to build all the parking. But once you build all the parking, the only thing you can really build is like that 11 unit condo building. You can't build 28 units because you can't build enough parking for that on that property. So of all of our housing units in LA, 8% of them are in this 2 to 4 unit type. But of all of the types of all the 2 to 4 unit buildings we have in LA, only 4% have been built in the last 2 decades. So the vast majority of our 2 to 4 unit housing was built long ago, versus our 50 unit housing, our really large buildings, like the ones that bring in the crane that's like hanging out and there's like 150, 200 people working on it with 2x4s everywhere, whatever. Those are 10% of all of our housing units across LA. But of the housing we built here since, of that type of unit, 21% of them have been built in just the last 2 decades. Just the last 2 decades, a fifth of all that housing has been built. And if you look at all the housing across LA that we've built since 2000, from 2000 to 2016, nearly half has been in those really large buildings. So that didn't used to be the case. That didn't used to be how we built our housing. We used to build a lot more of this sort of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 unit buildings. But that's basically impossible to build anymore because largely parking requirements, not exclusively, but largely. And at the same time, down LA, which accounts for only 1% of all the city's land, is accommodating 20% of all the new housing that we've seen built in the last 20 years. And that's actually a trend that is getting stronger. So just 5, 6 years ago, it was like 16, 17% of all of our new housing was in downtown. It's now 20%. It's moving more in that direction because downtown is one of the only places that we really are allowing housing to get built in large quantities. So at the end of the day, building less housing than people demand drives high housing costs. That's a conclusion from the California Legislative Analyst's Office, which is a nonpartisan office up in Sacramento, who looked at this question across the state a few years ago. And I offer here the 2 charts that one on the left you've seen already, which was the construction we did in LA. And I indicated the red bar on the bottom, which shows when redlining was still legal. And then on the lower right-hand side, you'll see that our housing prices in LA, people will say, or California, people will say, California has always been more expensive than the rest of the country. And that's true. And you can see that in 1940, 1950s, 1960s, 70s, it was more expensive to buy a home in California than in the rest of the country. But then that decouples entirely. There's this rapid growth in the cost of housing to buy or rent a home in California compared to the rest of the country, which happens subsequently, right around the time that we've made it nearly impossible to build housing. So we've made it nearly impossible to build housing. Housing prices go through the roof. We passed Prop 13 so that we locked in the advantage for all the people who were able to buy housing when it was less expensive. And now we have this incredible housing crisis at a time when we're building less housing than we ever have before. I said I mentioned the California Environmental Quality Act. I think this is an important thing because this is still the law of the land, very much. And I think there are some really good things about CEQA. But it's important to note that when it comes to housing, fewer than 1 in 8 lawsuits from CEQA are filed by groups that have records of environmental advocacy. That is to say, the vast majority of CEQA lawsuits are filed by people who aren't doing it, who have no record of working in the environment. This isn't their background. This isn't their interest. 80% of those lawsuits target infill housing. They target housing going in cities. So when we think about the environment and where we want to build housing and where we want to make it possible for people to live so they're not dependent on an automobile, where they can ride a bike, where they can walk, where they can take transit, where they have things within local access to them, that's in the city. And the vast majority of lawsuits, the vast majority of which are filed by people who aren't concerned about the environment, target that housing. They're making it much harder to build housing in places where people can be more environmentally friendly. And I want to say a quick thing about homelessness as well. The main cause of our homeless crisis is housing and affordability. It's not to say it's the sole cause. It is to say the main cause. It's the primary factor in this. And this is something that's been shared on or it's been evaluated and looked at and talked about by a number of people who are far smarter about these things than I am. And I want to note that in LA County, we do a count every year of the number of folks who are experiencing homelessness. We do it in January every year. That number keeps going up. It keeps going up. In 2020, it was 13% higher than it was in 2019, which was 12% higher than it was in 2018. And in the midst of this pandemic, well, all we're hearing is this number is going to explode. The number of people who are living on the streets is exploding compared to where it was before. And to me, it sort of begs the question, well, when we were seeing economic good times, I'll put that in air quotes, good times, in the late 2018, 2019, 2020, our homelessness numbers were going up. And here we're in the midst of a pandemic, which are the bad times, and our homelessness crisis is going up. So clearly this is not a reflection of whether or not the economy is doing well. Something else entirely is going on. Some people, I offer a couple of things here because I think it's important to address. Some people will say, well, the homeless are coming from somewhere else. 75% of the homeless folks in LA County were living here when they lost their home. And 2/3 have lived here for more than a decade. And 70% are neither mentally ill nor have substance abuse issues. The numbers of folks with mental illness and substance abuse in our homeless population are higher than our housed population, but not significantly so. It's not like the folks who are homeless because of these things. And largely, the numbers are slightly higher on our homeless population, probably because they're homeless. Probably because they don't have a roof over their heads that they can rely on and count on to be there day in and day out to have a good night's sleep. The Black share of our LA County population is 8%, but of our homeless population is 33%. And to me, this is the stat that is here's systemic racism right in front of your face. So if we can look at that and say, yeah, our housing policy is not systemically racist, then we're blinding ourselves to what's right in front of us. When 8% of our population in LA County is Black, but 1/3 of our homeless population is Black, that's systemic racism in our housing policy right there. So I want to say a quick word about our institutional agency and power. These are a couple quotes from Dorothy Walker, who founded the American Planning Association, the APA, which is sort of it's the umbrella organization for professionals in the planning industry, I guess. The first thing, she wrote up a whole thing on Streets Blog, which I've got the link here on the bottom, which I think is a phenomenal write-up that she offered. And a couple of quotes I pulled from this. The first that she says, the very people who support progressive change elsewhere, they use local control of land use to prevent structural change in their communities that would advance the cause of racial justice. And then she also says, as long as the people who own land and are already housed have total control over growth and change in their communities, we will not achieve true racial justice and social equity. So she's calling out, I offered a couple photos here of just generic planning meeting where a developer will come in and say, I'm going to build I want to build a building here that's going to replace this parking lot or this gas station or whatever. And all these folks show up, almost entirely probably white, wealthier homeowners who are all there to say it's too tall, it's going to create traffic, it's going to create shadows, whatever the case may be. Our systems empower folks who stand to benefit the most from them, right? It empowers white, wealthy homeowners who have the structural agency that's been given them, that institutional power that I talked about, that institutional opinion. And that has played out decade after decade after decade. So that institutional opinion, that single family zoning, that is 75% of our residentially zoned land, plays out. So you can just see, just looking across the landscape of LA, how we have proliferated single-family homes across communities, which for decades were historically available only to white home buyers. Those are the vast majority of housing in our city. The vast majority of land use in our city. Our single-family homes actually only accommodate about 35-40% of our population in LA, in the city of LA, but they take up 75% of our residentially zoned land. So we've really kind of cordoned off. We sort of built a wall, if you will, around where people can live based on our zoning policy and how we sort of designated what land can be used for what. So to reiterate, single-family housing has been a wildly successful affordable housing program. Think about how many people were able to access housing for the very first time because the federal government stepped in and said, we're going to subsidize this back in the 1930s, who then subsequently were able to build wealth, were able to build enormous amounts of wealth because of that program. And then they can write off a bunch of that. They can write it off because the federal government also subsidizes by saying, if you have a mortgage interest over, you can write that off on your taxes. But then with Prop 13, we went a step further here in California. We approved this measure that basically took property taxes, which at the time comprised over half of our municipal resources came from property taxes. That's now less than a quarter. And the big thing that sort of filled in the gap of what we lost by our property taxes not going up at the same level as our property values did, the big thing that makes up that difference is sales taxes. So we have shifted our tax burden from our mostly white, mostly wealthier homeowners to folks which we're using a tax, the sales tax, which we know is regressive, to a sales tax which is overwhelmingly regressive. And we continue to give to single family homeowners the greatest institutional agency and power. And I just want to end as far as our history as present with this note. This won't solve our housing crisis. This is how we've done housing for decades. This is the Centennial Project. You may be looking to say, well, there's nothing there. It's just a piece of land. Well, that's right. This is the Tejon Ranch. If you've ever driven out on the 5, going North LA County, going into up over the mountains, the Tejon Pass down into the San Joaquin Valley, you've driven right past this. It is a piece of land. In this case, the Centennial Project will be a piece of land will be 12,000 acres, which will have 19,300 homes, or about 1.5 homes an acre, which is the same density as Rancho Palos Verdes. It's being marketed as a walkable village with smart transportation and an environmentally friendly approach, even though it's 60 miles from downtown LA and 30 miles from Bakersfield, which is the closest large city to this location. But don't worry, 18% of the housing will be designated affordable for low-income households. The only issue, I suppose, in addition to the fact that you're going to have to drive to do just about anything, is this is a high fire danger area. About a quarter of all of California's housing is in the wildland urban interface area where it's high fire danger zone. So who's in charge around here in our region? LA County has 10 million residents, which, as if we were our own state, we'd be the 8th largest state in the country. We'd be a larger state than, all these states we're hearing about right now, the election, Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona. We'd be larger than any one of those states if we were our own states. And the 10 smallest states population combined is still fewer people than live here. And we have this really dispersed governance. In the upper right-hand corner, I've got some of the cities of LA County. I mentioned 88 cities. Every one of those cities has its own city council. They have their own planning codes, their own zoning, all that stuff individual to each individual city, which, as I mentioned earlier on the point around white flight, that's what it's turned into here on this map, is every single city with its own form of local control. Even in the city of LA, we have 15 city council districts, each one representing 250,000 people. And their city council members operating sort of as like their own little mayor. But we have 15 city council districts. Then I just offered a couple other maps of congressional and state senate districts. And then we have the LA County supervisorial districts, where for the very first time in our county's history, our 5 members of our LA County Board of Supervisors are all women, which is phenomenal. And I would also note that in LA County, even though we have 88 cities for our 10 million residents, of those 10 million residents, 1 million of them don't even live in one of those cities. They live in what we call unincorporated LA County, in places which are not incorporated into a city. 1 million of our residents. And those residents have one elected official that represents them. And that's one of these supervisors who are elected. When you divide up, do the math, 5 supervisors across a county of 10 million people, each supervisor represents 2 million people. So it's just the governance. Where do you go to change housing policy in this environment? Where do you make the difference? How do you change things? It's incredibly difficult and incredibly dispersed. So we have a theory of change for abundant housing in LA. And that has 3 components. 1, everyone should have a home they can afford. 2, communities need to be livable and sustainable. And 3, we need to address the urgent climate crisis. In terms of everyone having a house that they can afford, I referenced earlier the legislative analyst report from the state, where they basically said building less housing people demand drives high housing costs. They also said that affordable housing programs, so like LA's Transit-Oriented Communities program, they have a role. They help to supplement broader changes that facilitate more private housing construction. And ultimately what the LAO concluded was that policies need to be changed to allow more private housing construction in our coastal urban areas where the demand is highest. In terms of our second point about theory of change being communities being more livable and sustainable, This was a study that was done a couple of years ago by the Smart Prosperity Institute in Canada, which looked at the cost at a city, at any given city, to provide all of the services the city would provide. What did it cost per household? And they found that in an urban environment, the cost per household for the city was $1,400 a year. And in a suburban environment was $3,400. Literally, the only thing you've changed here is how far apart your homes are. That's it. That's all you've changed. But when you think about it, if a city is a square mile and they're zoned sort of, to only allow so many homes, and it's sort of sprawled out, there's only so many people, and they've got to provide coverage for policing, for fire, for water treatment, and for providing water, for doing sewer, for roads. Essentially, a lot of those things are kind of the same amount, if not, maybe a little bit less for a sprawled community, as if that same square mile had a bunch more people in it. Because you're still going to have the same sort of water pipes, the general water pipes, the general sewer pipes, whatever. You're probably not going to have that much more roads. So like these things become inordinately more expensive per household in a suburban environment than an urban environment. And if we want communities that are livable and sustainable, we really have to be thinking about, over the long term, what can we afford to do and not have our cities continually having to sort of bankrupt themselves. And the last piece on our theory of change is it's important to address the urgent climate crisis. The International Panel on Climate Change at the United Nations said at the last bullet here, effective urban planning could reduce greenhouse gas emissions from urban transport between 20 and 50%. They're essentially saying, look, if you allow people to live in communities where they can walk and bike and take transit and they're not car dependent, that could address the vast majority of the crisis that we see in front of us. And I just want to note, for as intractable as our climate crisis may seem to us, that of all of the CO2, all the carbon dioxide that humans have put into the environment over the entirety of humanity, over all of humanity, more than half of that CO2 we put into the atmosphere in just the last 40 years. More than half in just the last 40 years. So what we are doing today has ripple effects. And we can very clearly see that if we even change just a few things just 40 years ago, we could be in a very different place than we are today. And so you have to start somewhere. You have to take a first step somewhere. So we have some policy approaches. I'm not going to spend much time on these, but I do want to just offer up a few of our policy approaches here about Housing LA that we're encouraging folks to consider. And those are four key things. One, make more room for more homes. Two, make it easier, cheaper, and faster to build homes, because the longer that homes languish in sort of the approvals process and the timelines for CEQA and all this stuff, that adds cost. And that cost has to be recouped somehow, and often gets recouped with how much sort of bells and whistles get thrown on new housing in order to make it luxury or whatever, so that developers can recoup more of that cost that they can actually afford to build it in the first place. Our third part of our pro-housing agenda is we need to raise money for affordable homes. That's a big thing. Now, we're not going to be able to raise enough money to build public housing for everyone who needs it. There is way too much of a crisis on our hands. We have a shortage of over 500,000 affordable homes in LA County for the people who live here right now. A shortage of 500,000 homes in LA County for the people who live here right now. That is inordinately expensive to even try and build enough affordable housing for the folks who are here already. Which is not to say we shouldn't do everything we can. That is part of our agenda. We should do everything we can. The fourth part of our pro-housing agenda is protecting tenants. We cannot be building housing at the expense of people who already live in housing in a community. So in other words, if all we're going to do is say, well, we're only going to allow new housing to get built where we already allowed it to get built before, and not think more creatively and find ways to make more room in ways that aren't supporting the folks who live in the community already, then we're doing this wrong. Like we can't just say, oh, well, we can only build multifamily housing where we already build it, which, by the way, we already have it, and therefore building more is going to require a tear down what's already there. Like we have to be able to protect our tenants. So hopefully you're thinking about getting involved. I'd love that. And here's just a few ways you can do that. You can join us, join Abundant Housing LA and everyone in LA. You can become a member. You can donate. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can attend hearings on housing projects, which ironically in this era of the pandemic, maybe even a little easier to do, because you don't have to be at City Hall in the middle of the day. You can just log in on whatever thing they're using or call into a phone and let them hear your perspective on something during public comment, because they have to take public comment on everything that they're doing hearings around. Our organizing director is Roderick Hall. I've got his email here. He's a really great guy. If you want to get involved in some way to speak out in favor of projects or policies or anything like that, He's doing phenomenal work. Drop him a line. We're working a lot on the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which is known as RHNA, which is a state thing, which right now in Southern California, the Southern California Association of Governments this past year approved the coastal plan, which, to that earlier point from the Legislative Analyst's Office about needing to build more housing in our urban coastal areas, that's what this plan would do. But every single city has to zone to allow for that housing to get built. And in the city of LA alone, they have to zone to allow for nearly 500,000 more homes to get built over the next 8 years. Now, you'll remember, over 30 years, we removed the zone capacity for 6 million residents, right, from 1960 to 1990. So it may seem like 500,000 new units from over the next 8 years is only getting us part of the way there anyway, but it's a big deal because right now we're only building a fraction of that, 10,000 a year. So that over 8 years, that's 80,000. So we need to have zone capacity to allow for more than 6 times that. You can also be a project volunteer. This is a way you can actually invest 2 to 5 hours a week where you can really kind of dig in and find out what's coming up in my community, what's coming in my area, and help organize your neighbors to speak out in support of new housing in your communities. I guarantee you, as someone who's been involved in this space for a while, it's very easy for folks who want to oppose something to find a reason to oppose it. It is much harder for folks to find a reason to support it. And having people like yourselves who come out into hearings, whether at the neighborhood council or city council or zoning administrator or planning commission, and say, I actually really think this is important for us to be doing. We should support this. I'm in favor. I live in the community. That makes a big difference when people hear that perspective. So that's the conclusion of my presentation. That's my email. If you want to shoot me an email, please do so. You can find me on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter, Luke H. Klipp. I tweet about a lot of things, not just housing. So you may not want to follow me on Twitter, but I certainly welcome it. And I'm happy to take your questions now.
Thanks, Luke. So hi, everybody. This is Esteban again. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. And we've got some lined up already. So Nick asks, is the distinction, this is a question from a while ago when you were discussing the history, is the distinction the court was trying to draw that the city as a government entity can't zone discriminately, but developers and homeowners can discriminate as individuals?
It's a great question. I am not familiar enough with the nuances of the decision by the court. However, my understanding from the decision at the time was yes, that the government was not allowed as a municipal authority to discriminate. However, private citizens had that within their right as property owners, as you know, sort of going to the points that Prop 14 was trying to make when it was saying you should be able to have control over your own, who gets to live in your own community or whatever. That was something that they did allow for property owners to continue to do. And they certainly reaffirmed that in their decision in 1928 when they ruled in favor of deed restrictions. Excuse me, 1926.
Thanks, Luke. We've got a couple of questions from Sarah. Sarah asks, Abundant Housing is doing great work coalition building to transform LA's housing element, which must be updated by October 15th, 2021. What and who are the biggest obstacles to accomplishing your goals in the housing element update?
Well, that's a great question, Sarah. I would say that there are a couple organizations that have sort of staked out their sort of, I referenced sort of like the groups that are suing to try and overturn the city's transit-oriented communities program. And so there are actual like organized entities that have resources, right? That they have resources they bring to bear that are going to fight however they can the city's update to the RHNA, to its regional housing needs allocation and its housing element update. But more likely than that is going to be individual homeowner associations. I've seen recently that there's homeowner associations on the west side that are organizing right now to oppose anything changing. And this is, to my earlier point about institutional agency, institutional opinions, where especially on LA's west side, we have communities largely white communities, largely homeowner communities that have enormous amounts of institutional power that are not going to just relinquish it. They're not going to just say, oh, we need to allow for more housing. Great, we'll do it. And then thus you end up with the city sort of rolling over and saying, okay, go ahead and we'll leave them alone and we'll just continue to put the burden for addressing our housing crisis on the communities that have already been overburdened all along. So I would say that largely it's going to end up being homeowners association and individual homeowners, people who just sort of are empowered by the process because it tends to empower homeowners who are going to speak out and fight it and who are going to feel empowered to push their city council members to do everything they can to keep the city from doing its job to provide the zone capacity for, almost 500,000 new units over the next 8 years.
And Sarah's got two other questions. I'll ask the second one first because I think it's very relevant to what we were just discussing. Sarah asks, thanks for exploring power and privilege and governance. Can you talk a little about your experience serving on a neighborhood council? Should LA defund neighborhood councils like Seattle did?
Oh gosh, Sarah. I have many opinions about neighborhood councils. That's a neighborhood council 101, not a housing 101. Here's what I'll say. I think that neighborhood councils are really useful in bringing government to the people, in helping people get engaged in government stuff that's going on. When I was the president of our neighborhood council in Los Feliz, we did some clothing and food drives. We had some community events. We did some cleanup events. That kind of stuff I thought was invaluable. We were able to change people's lives for the better with that. Where I think it becomes difficult is when you've got a developer who comes in and presents on, I'm going to, replace this gas station with a 90-unit apartment building, of which 15 will be affordable. And you have people who are almost entirely lay folks, right? Like, we're not experts on this stuff, right? Like most folks in the neighborhood council, we come at this from our own individual experiences. We're not people who are necessarily steeped in the understanding of the history of stuff or sort of what all the policies are or whatever. And then we hear a bunch of folks in the community say, no, and they hand us a petition, say, no. And so the neighborhood council in that case just becomes sort of an amplifier of voices that are already empowered by the process, right? Rather than being a venue just to vet what is going on and have a conversation about it. And that's where I think it gets a little touchier, a little more difficult. And furthermore, because there's what you saw in Seattle is they were very intentional in the space they created. Seattle created a board of folks that was intentionally seeking to have representation from across all of Seattle's communities. What happens in our neighborhood councils often, not always, but often, is it's just the folks who self-select as caring enough to be involved in this work. And more often than not, that has been whiter, wealthier, older homeowners who are not really representative of the community. In my community in Los Feliz, when I joined our neighborhood council board, the vast majority of the board were homeowners in a community that was 75% renters, where the majority were white, the vast majority were white, including myself, right? In a community that is majority non-white. So, but there's no thing within the city charter or anything else that says, well, the neighborhood council has to be representative of the community by virtue of whatever this or that thing. It's just, here it is, and the neighborhood councils can self-determine how they want to govern them, how they want to govern and be governed and whatever else. And so neighborhood councils create their own bylaws. Some neighborhood councils have seats that they set aside for homeowners associations. Some set seats aside for students. Some set seats aside for renters, because they recognize, like, if we don't have a renter seat in a community that's majority renters, we won't even have one on our board. I mean, we have some serious challenges to contemplate and address in how we work through our neighborhood council system, which is not to say that they don't add value. It is to say that I think it's important to recognize sort of how they play a role in some cases, and unfortunately reinforcing a lot of these systems of systemic racism that I've been talking about today.
And Sarah also asks, some agencies are making virtual public participation permanent. BART in the Bay Area just did. Should we work for that in LA?
I mean, here's what I'll say is I have found personally, it is much easier to be engaged in the civic process now than it was a year ago for me. But I will also recognize that I have my lens, right? And for some people who don't have internet access, computer access as easily, it's still a barrier. Now, what I will also say is it more of a barrier than for when we had meetings basically only available online, or excuse me, in person? And that I would say probably no, actually it's significantly improved. So I think there needs to be sort of a consideration of a mix of like, whenever, God willing, we are through this pandemic, we're going to go back to some level of in-person work, of in-person meetings, but making it possible for people to participate through online, through web-based telephone. I have staffed Mayor Garcia on the Metro Board of Directors for the last several years. People can give comment now on Metro board meetings on the phone, which you couldn't do during board meetings when they're in person. I hope that's something they keep. And that going forward, that even when the board meets again in person, that people will still be able to just phone in, because actually probably more people have access to phones than anything else. People can call in and participate in that mechanism, or they can give comment through email or whatever else. I think that is a really important change. And don't worry about all your questions, Sarah. They've all been great questions. So that, yeah, I hope that they retain at least some of what we've seen as far as the opportunities for people to engage in the virtual space that has come about as a result of the pandemic.
Thanks, Luke. Michelle asks a related question, I think. How effective is it to talk about institutionalized racism at public hearings about specific developments? Not at all.
And I say that as someone who has tried to. Here's what I would say, and I've flirted with the idea of putting together like a public comment 101 kind of thing. What moves people when you address a group of either neighborhood council members or planning commissioners or city council members is your story. It's telling a story. It's not saying this is institutionalized racism, whatever. It's saying I am fortunate to be able to live in this, whatever your story is. For me, it's I love my community. I want other people to be able to enjoy in my community too. And so I'm going to support this because this is going to make it possible for more people to be a part of this incredible community. Like, that's going to move more people than me saying the people who oppose this are opposing it, are reinforcing an institutionally racist system or a systemically racist system. That's not going to move people. So if you're really trying to move people to come up to a place of agreement or an understanding of where you're coming from, I would just say maybe it's not the best. Maybe it's not the best comment. But that said, it's still important to understand it. It's still important to let it inform you. And the reason that this Housing 101 really grounds us in this conversation of housing and understanding it from a perspective of how it is systemically racist is so that we understand that that's where it's coming from. So that we all come from that place of that shared understanding, so that when we start to see things that pop up, that come up along the way, we can recognize how those things either reinforce that systemic racism or they might help break it down, right? So for me, for instance, anytime there is an apartment building that is proposed in a predominantly single family community, that is going to break down the systemic racist nature of our housing policy, our housing system, period, end of story. Because we know that apartment building will more likely than not have more non-white folks than the single family community that it will be part of. And that is not to say that we should then say to people, you should support this, and if you don't, you're racist. It is to say that we should recognize that there are some changes that are just by the nature of what they are going to change the outcomes in ways for the better for everyone.
Thanks, Luke. Jason asks, what are some of the common pieces of misinformation that you find yourself fighting against when it comes to housing?
That's an interesting question. And that's one I don't think I've ever gotten. Common pieces of misinformation. I mean, I think, so I would say that I have a bit of a beef with the question, because I think behind every bit of the misinformation, only succeeds to the degree that there's a kernel of truth, right? People aren't going to believe something that they know is just totally outlandish and ridiculous. But if there's enough within it that is believable, then even if it goes far beyond that, people will at least believe it enough to go with it, right? So, for instance, for me, you know, I hear a lot of folks saying like transit equals gentrification, like building a transit line equals gentrification. There is truth to the fact that we have found that homes located within proximity to new transit tend to appreciate faster than homes further away. There is truth to that. At the same time, we have also found that if you create programs that create more affordable housing, you can actually create more affordable housing along transit than existed prior to its existence if you're intentional about it and specific about that. So just because someone says one thing doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case or that it has to be the case. And so I think where this gets difficult is that, like, for instance, new housing tends to sort of become the demon in our housing conversation. Oh, that thing over there is the reason that housing's expensive, whatever. But in a city of LA where we have 1.5 million homes, right? We have 1.5 million homes today. That 10,000 new units of housing we're building every year, that's not the reason it's so expensive, right? Adding less than, can I do the math on this quickly? Adding less than 1/8% of new housing a year, that less than 1/8% of new housing is not the reason LA is so unaffordable. The reason LA is so unaffordable is because we're only able to create 1/8% of new housing relative to our overall new housing that we have in the city, among other reasons. There are other reasons, to be clear. But by making it so incredibly difficult to accommodate our ongoing population growth in our region, when we're already the most overcrowded region in the country, dealing with massive crises, layered on crises, the new housing that we see going up over there is not the reason our region's unaffordable. But I think that's one of the things that we definitely hear is, oh, well, because that building went in, now it's all unaffordable. No, everything's unaffordable in our region right now. Everything is unaffordable. My home's appreciated value is more than doubled in the 7 years that I've lived in this home. There's been nothing that's gone up anywhere within a mile of our home in that time. It's not because of some new housing project that has suddenly become unaffordable. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions to your question, Jason. That's one of the biggest misconceptions that I hear that definitely bothers me. I do think that it's important to understand the interrelationships of land uses and proximities and all that, but I think it becomes oversimplified because we sort of have our view of, well, that's what's different and that's what's changing over here or there, so that must be the reason. And it's actually, the reasons are actually tend to be much more complicated and difficult and grounded in a very long history that's going to take a long time to get ourselves out of.
One thing, if I may also chime in, Luke, on this, to Jason's question, one thing that I've seen in my own neighborhood, there was an affordable development project proposed in my neighborhood in Southeast LA, Walnut Park. And one of the big talking points that the opponents were using was that affordable housing depreciates our homes. So this is an older part of LA. So it's a mixed. The zoning here is it's not entirely residential, but the main person who was opposing this project happened to live right behind the proposed site, and he talked about the shade in his backyard and all of these other things. And one of his prominent points was, well, we're going to lose value in our homes, which nothing supports. I mean, nothing I've seen supports. Maybe you can speak to it, Luke, differently. But
no, actually, that is a common misconception. Actually, now that you say it, because I just saw the other day there was a firm rebuttal by an analysis that showed that when affordable housing goes in, like explicitly designated affordable housing goes into a community, the values of the homes around it all still increase just like any other community. It does not depress the values of homes adjacent to it. And when you create new amenities, like you can in a new project where you can have like a new little grocery store in the corner store or a restaurant space or whatever on the ground floor, that actually adds value to the community, to everyone's community. At the same time, you're creating housing for people who otherwise couldn't afford it above that. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions.
Yeah, we've got actually two questions. So Sarah asks, in LA, KCRW recently followed the money on a city-funded supportive housing project in the Westlake neighborhood. Yeah. What they reported wasn't pretty. In LA, it costs us more than 2 times what the state spends per unit for supportive housing. Any thoughts on what reforms would help ensure HHH funds are used more efficiently?
So 2 thoughts, because I think unfortunately there's 2 things happening here that are because we're sort of coming at this from a lay perspective, end up getting conflated. And I should also preface by saying I didn't actually read the article, and I should have, and I apologize for that, because I should be able to speak to this directly. But I've heard bits and pieces about what's going on, and frankly, I am really mad to see resources for housing getting misused. And I should have read the story to really be able to speak to that more directly. I think, though, the broader issue with HHH and the cost of each new unit in LA costs somewhere between $600,000 and $700,000 to build. That is because of that is the cost of the land, because it's made it so hard to build that land values have just skyrocketed. That is the cost of the materials. That is the cost of having to build all the parking that goes with that, which is a big chunk of it. That is the amount of time it takes to get approvals, and time adds cost. All of these things add on one on the other. And the end result of that is, for all the money that we approved in LA in bonds with Measure HHH to build housing, it's not enough to build the amount of housing we wanted to see built with that money. That's just the plain truth of it. And also, because of the zoning being what it is, there's not a whole lot of opportunities where you can even build that housing. So, we're trying to just throw a bunch of money and hope that that's enough to solve the challenges, which are much more complicated and nuanced than just a matter of having the resources. That's not the issue. I mean, that's part that I shouldn't say it's not the only issue. It's an issue. But the issue is, it's the zoning. It's the way we have done. We've allowed housing over time. It is all of the elements of what it takes to even build housing, et cetera. So it's a lot of things all sort of laying around there. And I for one, am frustrated and upset at just how difficult it remains to be to create housing, whether it is by virtue of publicly funded bonds or private resources.
Thanks, Luke. Ellen asks a question, sort of a 2-part question. And Ellen also says, thanks a million for this. Ellen appreciates you highlighting the government policies that have codified expectations of who lives where and what conditions. And the question is, what role does the real estate industry play in who gets to buy where? I'd like to know how brokers divide a territory so that I have mostly white neighbors and white brokers, and I don't see people of color buying homes here.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ellen. That is something that's being studied. That article I cited in my presentation about appraised values of homes, that was squarely pointing the finger at the real estate industry and how appraisals work. And there have been studies in just the last year that have shown that if you change the pictures of the quote unquote family that lives in a home, that if you just doing a study and you change the pictures from a white family to a black family, it changes the appraised value significantly, something like 15-20%. So there is a lot that the real estate industry has still to account for. As far as sort of like steering people toward one community or another, I mean, these things are really, really tough to sort of break down and understand in a meaningful way that you can really truly address it. But I know there are folks who are studying it and are trying to find ways to address where the discrimination continues to perpetuate. Was there a second question, Esteban?
Sorry?
Was there a second part to that question?
How is a small developer able to build affordable housing if land costs are so high? Good luck.
I mean, it's tough. It's really tough. I mean, there's a reason that you very rarely see anything fewer than like 30 units in an 100% affordable housing development. because the time and effort that is required to assemble all of the funding to make it possible to build, because when you see a 100% affordable housing project, we should be clear. There's a big difference between a 100% affordable housing project and a project that has like a 10% or 11 or 12 or 15% affordable component, and the rest is market rate. Something that has an affordable component, the rest is market rate, that's going to be almost exclusively privately funded. That's money coming from private banks, private lenders, that they're then, because they're getting some additional density bonus or height bonus or whatever, that is making it possible for them to pass along some of the benefit they receive from that to some portion of the units that then they make available for folks based on their income level if they're lower income. A 100% affordable housing development is almost entirely going to be nonprofit housing builders who rely on public funding and philanthropic funding. They are not relying on private banks. They are a completely different subset of folks who look at how to build housing through the same kind of materials and zoning and all that stuff, but a very different lens. So they have a very different approach. And typically, you're not going to see anything less than a 30-unit building because you just can't assemble the dollars needed for something smaller, because that's just not the kind of resources that are available for 100% affordable housing projects. It's 2:02. I just want to say thank you to all of you for sticking around, for being here on this Saturday afternoon, for engaging in this, for asking phenomenal questions. Let me just put my email back up on the screen so that if you want to reach out to me, you certainly can anytime. I'm happy to take questions. And just thank you for being here with us today. And if you think other folks would be interested in this, or if you know folks who you want me to sort of tailor this to present this to some group of folks that you work with or that you engage with in some organization or whatever, I'm happy to have that conversation with you and figure out where we can go from there. There's my email, lukehklipp@gmail.com, or you can find me on Twitter @lukehklipp. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks, y'all.